So a quick overview of the presentation. We'll talk about the utilization of public cord blood units, the possibility of improving bank economics through targeted banking, and how we support cord blood bank collection efforts for the NMDP, and improve the bank economics through other products and services. I think the morning there was a couple of really good sessions on what is the future of cord blood banking, and that is cellular therapies, and I'll loop back at the very end on that. So these are some transplant data. As you all know, the National Marrow Donor Program manages the United States registry for unrelated donor cells to be used in transplantation. And so in that role, we not only facilitate access to it, but we also continue to monitor the industry and try and understand both where it's been but also where it's going. So this graph looks at the different cell sources, the total number of transplants facilitated through the NMDP, and the cell sources for those transplants. And as we can see, the prominence of the peripheral blood stem cells as a source, and then the growth of cord blood as an additional source in the last 10 years or so. And this shows the growth of transplant activity worldwide as monitored by CIBMTR, the Center for International Blood and Marrow Transplant Research. This isn't a complete conglomeration of all statistics, but I think it's representative of the trends based upon the CIBMTR data. And we see both the growth of autologous as that continues to grow, but also the continuing growth of allogeneic over the years. And that is both related and unrelated. When we look at allogeneic specifically through the CIBMTR data, again, we see that the sibling donations are roughly leveling off, while the growth of the allogeneic transplant from unrelated donor sources continues to increase. And part of this is the fact that more and more of an older population is receiving the transplants, and sibling donations are not as possible due to complications for the sibling themselves, as well as some other information, including the fact that here we see the one-year survival data on both unrelated and sibling donation. We see these lines getting very close. Well, this is good news, obviously, that we have been able, through the hard work of the transplant community, to improve outcomes to where there is little differentiation between the cell source, and this enhances the opportunity for the unrelated donor registry to be helpful for patients who don't have a sibling and still can get the same, roughly the same clinical results. Well, when we look at the cord blood data, here we are looking at cord blood transplants by year through the NMDP. And the NMDP provides transplant services primarily to the U.S. About 80% of the cord blood transplants facilitated in the U.S. come through the NMDP, but we also provide cell sources for worldwide activity, and this is a combination of those cell sources coming through the NMDP. For 2011, the number of transplants here is 1,235. That was a growth of about 7% over the previous year in transplants. The previous year's growth, 2010 over 2009, was 5.7%, almost 6%, 5.1%, excuse me. And the growth of 2009 over 2008 was 21%. So we see a dramatic growth in the 2005, 6, 7, 8, and then we start to see after 2009 a leveling off. And in fact, that leveling off continues. Assuming that we have the same market share, in 2012 year to date, the growth in transplants is about 2.8%, cord blood transplants. The overall growth in transplants is about 6% through the NMDP. So something is happening here in terms of the growth of transplants. This masks, however, something that perhaps we need to highlight. This is the number of transplants. This is not the number of cord blood units. If we look at the cord blood units through the NMDP, for instance, in 2011, I just said that the number of transplants was 1,235. The number of cord blood units used, facilitated through the NMDP, was 1,752. The difference obviously being primarily in double cord transplantation. The growth from 2011 over 2010 was 11% in total units used compared to 7% in total transplants. So what we saw was increasing use of transplantation in adults, therefore requiring cord blood transplantation in adults, therefore requiring more double cords. The fact of the matter is, in 2012 compared to 2011, the transplants, as I indicated, grew by 2.8%, so continuing leveling off in the number of transplants. But the utilization, the number of units, actually declined 2012 to 2011 year-to-date by 1.1%, declined. So this is some of those data that I just referred to, and the distinction between the shipments and the transplants. Here's the World Marrow Donor Association data. You saw some of these data already, and so I'll just quickly go through it. But as we can see, that continuing flattening from 2011 to 2010, and we think that same trend is occurring in 2012. This is the use of units reported into the WMDA, use of whether it's used nationally or internationally. As the inventories in each country grows, we see a certain leveling off of the international exchange. And I think also with some of the economic issues associated with transplantation. Transplant cells, these are looking at age 18 and over. So as we can see, the number of cord blood units, if you compared it to the total transplant number, cord blood is used less in older Americans. And here, this is the flip side. This is under than 18. And we can see a higher use of cord blood. So again, this is the cell size, the dose size issue, not the matching issue as much. And then as we look at the transplants for minority patients, we see a significant number of cord blood units. So cord blood has been very useful for the pediatric population, and we've seen continuing growth in transplants for the pediatric population, and for the minority population and the minority pediatric population in combination. So it's meeting its promise as we, people like Dr. Rubenstein and others got involved in this. It was to fill a gap that existed, and in fact, it has done so. So then we look at the utilization data, and I've shown these data in other locations, so I'll go through it quickly. But here we see the, in the blue line, the spread of the inventory in the NMDP, and we see the cord blood units used in the yellow line. And obviously, these are not overlaid very nicely. And when we looked at the WMDA data, the international data, we see the exact same pattern. So we did a little bit of analysis where we looked at what is an ideal cord blood bank. If you had $100 million and we're going to start all over, what would be the distribution you'd look for given the selections from the cord blood bank? And we see the yellow line what that ideal bank would be. And again, we've overlaid the existing inventory, and it's not as nice an overlay as we would like to see. So then we did some analysis about what are the economic costs of banking small units versus large units. And at the top, if you have a unit over 300 times 10 to the 7th TNC, your economic cost of a unit that you could sell for, let's say $30,000, is $3,528, a very nice cost to revenue opportunity. If you're banking units under 90 times 10 to the 7th TNC, it's going to cost you $194,000 to have a large enough inventory to have a unit selected out of that, even one unit selected out of that. So this is the data we were able to develop over the last couple of years and show that told us we needed to be more, that the banks should be more selecting in how they, what units they bank. This is the data, same data as I just showed you, but looking at minority specifically or African American specifically. And it's roughly the same data. So we wanted to say, if we shift to a higher cutoff, would we be disadvantaging the minorities? And the answer is no. We don't believe that's the case. So we said, well, what happens then in the growth of the national inventory if we use these higher cutoff levels? And of course, the growth of the national inventory will slow because we're not going to be banking as many units. It will take, I think STEM site, Jonas just indicated that at their higher cutoff, they're banking 1 out of 4, where perhaps they were banking almost 1 out of 2 before at the lower cutoff. So you're going to have slower growth. But the fact is, the banks, you're not banking units that would have been used. You're going to be banking the units that will be selected. So this slowing growth does not mean less choice or less diversity within the national inventory. It continues to grow in diversity as well as quality. So what are the impacts of this Tnc target that we've been talking about or advocating for? If we're going to try and keep up with the same inventory level growth, we will have to have current sites. But even if we're going to accept a lower inventory growth, we probably need to expand the number of collection activity to get to some appropriate level of growth. So whether it's current sites are more efficient or new sites are added, both of those options cost money to the banks. We do recognize diversity targets will be more difficult to reach. Diversity targets, not increasing diversity, that will happen. But the targets that the federal government has set in particular and that we had set when we had a program that supported banks in their collection activity, we know that those minority targets are harder to reach than the Caucasian targets, and we know that increasing the cutoff will slow that growth effort. It will not, again, mean we're becoming less diverse, it'll just slow it. And Dr. Kurtzberg has published some data recently on the higher discard rate for AFA in particular. On the other hand, when we look at the data about where minority populations select their cord blood units in terms of from the pool, while the plurality of time they will select from a donor who has the similar broad race characteristic, they still are receiving cord blood units from a much broader pool of units than just their own race characteristic. They are receiving them from the Caucasian, from African American. This is the beauty of the 4 of 6 activity. So challenges in growing the banking. Cord blood unit donation not available everywhere. This is an issue that the cord blood banks face, or that the public faces in trying to have the opportunity to donate. More public banks have limited resources, so how do we grow more collection sites if there's limited staff and dollars? Public banks incur costs for every unit and only generate a unit when the unit is selected, so there's that lag. Establishing new collection hospitals is time-consuming and expensive, and we are now seeing increased cost in the banking activity because of the FDA requirements. So what does NMDP do to help support the banks in this effort? In the past, we have provided some economic support, both in terms of donor collection as well as funding special grants for projects that hope to expand diversity in particular. More recently, we've helped the banks by developing common materials, both for OB awareness and education, as well as for donor education. We've been working on a remote collection project where banks might be able to collect from people interested in donating without establishing a formal relationship with a hospital. That might reduce some of the costs of setting it up. We're not sure the efficiency of that works out, though, and we're still studying that. We do work with the banks to pursue best practices and allow those to be exchanged amongst the banks. So where efficiency or quality can be improved by learning from their colleagues, we help to facilitate those discussions through quarterly meetings. We've also had conferences to exchange ideas, and we make information available through our website for banks and others to learn from. We also periodically do surveys. Recently, we did a survey of OBGYNs in markets where there are public and private banks regarding their knowledge and commitment to public banking. We learned from that and are passing that information along to the banks to help them understand how to deal with a dynamic marketplace that they may be in. And then we developed some consensus projects that the banks said they wanted to pursue that might help them become more efficient or more effective. I won't go through each one of these, but there's 8 projects here that are intended to help the banks become more effective, at least, in collection activity, hopefully more efficient, but also deal with this diversity issue. We wanted to know whether banks, what their threshold cutoff was, and we're learning through that banks are now growing that threshold to a higher level based upon some of the data we've seen as well as the data they've done themselves. We are also, but HRSA continues to, through their funding program, retain a 90 times 10 to the 7th TNC cutoff. We are working with HRSA to change that model. It's unfortunate because that is the single most important source of funding for collection activity, where 2 years ago that represented funding for 1/3 of the units being banked. Today it represents funding for 2/3 of the units being banked. So it's very critical that the federal government ensure that we're banking quality units in terms of TNC size. We've developed an OBGYN education program that will go online soon, which will allow OBs to be trained to meet the requirements of, that the banks have, and we think it meets the FDA requirements as well. We are pursuing initiatives with states interested in creating awareness and funding collections. California is the shining example, perhaps the only example today. They do provide funding for cord blood collections, or are working on getting that program off the ground. UC Davis is instrumental in that, and it's a very good program that we'd like to model in other states, and we've brought that to the other states' attention. Slow traction on that. We've worked with the FDA on different issues. One was to eliminate a hospital agreement requirement. That is that there had to be a formal agreement with each hospital that a bank collects at. We're looking at regional computerized model for potential donors to come to understand what the issues are and opportunities are for donation, where they might donate, whether they're qualified, and get them referred on to cord blood banks to eliminate some of that work at each bank. Again, pursue best practice techniques to improve collection efficiency by exchanging data, exploring group purchasing programs, and a long shot, maybe there's some relationships with hospital corporations that can be used to be more efficient in setting up these collection sites. So many initiatives, bank-driven initiatives for the most part, that we are working on to help the banks both expand their collection activity and hopefully do so on a more efficient basis. Well, what are the other growth opportunities? Since that was the initial title of my talk, and I thought about that a little bit, and you've heard some of this already today, so I'm glad I didn't go too far down this path. But obviously, banks have an opportunity to get into new products, and StemSite Jonas provided a great description of the pursuit that bank is undergoing to expand their revenue sources through private storage, through related family storage, storage of related products, and we heard about these different products as potential sources for cellular therapies. The meeting on the other side of the wall is going into this in much more detail. But obviously, if their growth is in cellular therapy use beyond our current understanding of transplantation use, these sources may be important for some of that. And then contract processing and banking services. Some banks outsource some of their activities, some sources insource for other banks. So there are other opportunities to create revenue. So what are the conclusions that I would reach at this juncture of the industry? We need, obviously, to encourage the banks to pursue quality over quantity in banking. We do think there is a sustainable model, but it means, for the short term even, but it means changing this idea of what should be banked rather radically. It also doesn't quite take into account the FDA influence. So we have to go back and model this cost issue with the FDA. And in informal discussions with some of the banks, New York, Duke, a couple of others, it is a very material impact. I think each bank's dealing with it differently, but it's material regardless of what bank we're talking about. So we need to remodel this stuff and see if it still works. Support clinical trials. Obviously, we need to, the industry in general, but NMDP and CIBMTR need to encourage the transplant centers in terms of looking at clinical trials that improve engraftment and reduce complications. We'll hear more about that here, and again on the other side of the wall, they've been talking about that too. Some very interesting efforts are underway around this expansion activity as well to address engraftment and reduce complications. So these are studies that I think will help get us over that next plateau, or get us over the plateau we're on in terms of cord blood use in a clinical setting for current indications. Obviously, we have to look at other product opportunities. Where else can cord blood units be used? And broadly support cellular therapy studies. So on this last point, There was some data here and a data again on the other side of the wall about how many studies are being done in cellular therapies. I think 2,700 was a kind of a refined number. About half of those are allogeneic, which is obviously a good sign for those who are developing on the public banking side a resource that would meet that threshold requirement. But what about the future? What are questions that this whole cellular therapy opportunity raises? Well, the first one is, will allogeneic cells be the choice over autologous cells for cellular therapy? So that's the first issue. Will they need allogeneic cells, which is what the public banks have? If we can get over that, yes, and some of the, certainly a lot of the research I said is in allogeneic use. If we can get over that, will there be a need for a large number of well-characterized products? Will these banks with vast numbers of cord blood units be useful for that allogeneic product? Or will we, as we heard earlier, the industry wants to move to something they can manufacture in multiple doses off of single donations? So do we need well-characterized products or not? Will immune reaction be important as a part of the therapeutic benefit or necessary or not? And then will the current inventory qualify for future therapeutic use in any event? So even if we need allogeneic products and we need well-characterized products, these units have all been banked under non-FDA approved conditions. So how will we be able to access the units in the inventory? Certainly the FDA understood this issue for transplant and allowed through a creative IND type process for these units to be accessible to the market. That is very good for these inventories that we've all accumulated and still are very good quality products for use in transplant. But will this be true as we move up the ladder to manufactured units? Will this product be useful, allowable for those manufacturers as they start going through manipulation, et cetera? I don't know, but I think it's a question we need to be looking at as we continue to grow these inventories. So those are my comments as I understand the industry today.
All right, we have time for a couple questions. Anybody have any questions of Michael? Yes.
The leveling off that you've observed that well coordinated with the leveling off of national economies. Mm-hmm. Do you think that is influencing transplantation in general?
I think certainly in Europe it is. I do think that the cost of this product and the cost of the therapy itself gives, I think, those economies where they have limited resources, fixed resources into their healthcare system, to pause about adding cord blood protocols versus perhaps going to haploidentical protocols as they look at their research interests. So I do think that's happening in at least the European countries. Whether that's happening in the US, I think, is a good question. Certainly, some of the data over the last couple of years is a little distorted because there were some great trials underway about double cord versus single cord in pediatrics, some other trials that perhaps caused some of the use to go up a little bit artificially. But I think now transplant centers are pausing about adding new protocols for cord blood where they might not have had that in light of the expense, but perhaps in light of the alternative to look at haploidentical. So even in the US, I think we're seeing some leveling for that reason.
There was also a correlation in those 2 years with fairly dramatic increases in the price of a unit of cord, right?
There was, but I don't think until recently that became an issue. And I'm not sure it's an issue today. It's just something we're watching very closely.
Yeah. Okay. All right. Yes.
So sorry. I was just going to add to that because we were concerned about the levelling off in the UK as well, but we've noticed this year that actually there's been about almost a 70% increase in cord blood usage amongst our transplant centres, and the Brits can be best described as late adopters when it comes to cord blood in transplants. So I think there are encouraging green shoots of recovery maybe. Maybe there's a bit of a hiccup and people are questioning the use, and it seems to be increasing again. But
yeah, she was good.
You described the possibility of relationships with hospital corporations as maybe a long shot. Do you mean buy-in from executive level management to really push or adopt sort of a universal approach to collecting those public units within a larger hospital network? And if so, what do you think prohibits that buy-in?
So I think the issue that I probably used the wrong phrase, but it's much more difficult to do it from a top down. The banks have been most successful building support from the OBs and the local administrators because it's a burden on that OB suite and on those physicians. To approach this from a top-down standpoint is likely to be a much more difficult and costly approach. So it's an interesting idea to get the broad system buy-in, but perhaps a difficult thing to execute is kind of our assessment.
Yeah. Okay. All right, any other questions? All right, Michael, thank you very much.
Thank you.